They said she carried death in her womb and darkness in her heart, but what they didn't know was that sometimes a curse can become salvation. If you're ready for a tale that'll shake your very soul, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story from the Old West will change how you see destiny itself. In the harsh winter of 1887, the Wyoming Territory stretched endless and unforgiving, where frozen ground cracked like broken promises and the wind carried whispers of ancient secrets. The settlement of Bitter Creek huddled against the elements, a collection of weathered buildings and desperate souls clinging to hope in a land that showed no mercy. It was here that Marshal Thomas Kane found himself facing the impossible, protecting a woman the entire territory wanted dead. Sarah Whitmore had arrived on the last stagecoach before the snows, her belly heavy with child and her eyes holding shadows deeper than any canyon. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the curse that followed her bloodline, how every man who'd loved a Whitmore woman had met his end in ways too terrible to speak aloud. Kane didn't believe in curses. He believed in his rifle, his badge, and the code that said every soul deserved protection. But as bodies began dropping and strange lights danced across the frozen plains, even a man of iron resolve would question what evil might be growing in the darkness. The Old West had seen its share of mysteries, but none quite like this, where cowboys faced not just bullets and blades, but something that challenged the very fabric of what they thought they knew about life and death. Sarah's arrival coincided with the worst blizzard in 20 years, as if nature itself recoiled from her presence. Her stagecoach driver was found 3 days later, frozen solid but with terror still etched in his lifeless eyes. The horses had refused to approach within 50 yards of where she stood, pawing the ground and whinnying like they'd seen the devil himself. Kane watched from his office window as she trudged through the snow, one hand protecting her swollen belly, the other clutching a leather satchel that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. The townspeople crossed themselves and hurried indoors, mothers pulling their children close and men reaching for their guns. Even old Doc Henderson, who'd delivered half the babies in the territory, refused to examine her. "Marshal," she said when she finally reached his door, her voice carrying the weight of mountains, "I need sanctuary. Not for me, I'm already damned, but for the child I carry." Her green eyes held depths that spoke of ancient knowledge and unbearable sorrow. Kane had faced down outlaws and Indian war parties, but something in her gaze made his blood run cold. But what happened next would challenge everything he thought he knew about good and evil. That first night, young Billy Morrison went missing from his family's homestead. They found him at dawn, standing in the middle of the frozen creek, speaking in a language that predated any tongue known to the white man or red. His eyes had turned the same shade of green as Sarah's, and when his mother tried to approach, the ice beneath her feet began to crack and sing. Kane rode out with a posse of 6 men, their breath forming ghosts in the bitter air. The Morrison boy led them deeper into the wilderness, moving with purpose towards something only he could see. Every step they took, the temperature seemed to drop another degree, until even their horses' hooves rang like bells against the iron-hard ground. Dr. Clemens, the circuit preacher who'd been trapped in town by the storm, began reading from his Bible, but the words seemed to freeze and shatter before they could take hold in the air. "This ain't no ordinary possession," he whispered, his faith wavering for the first time in 30 years of frontier preaching. The boy turned and smiled, but it wasn't Billy's smile anymore. Sarah appeared then, walking through the snow without leaving footprints, her hand outstretched toward the child. "Let him come," she called, and there was power in her voice that made the very earth tremble. The boy's eyes cleared, and he collapsed into his mother's arms, remembering nothing of his midnight journey. But as they rode back to town, Kane noticed something that chilled him more than the wind. Sarah's belly had grown larger, as if whatever dwelt within had fed on the boy's temporary possession. Word spread faster than wildfire through Bitter Creek, carried on tongues sharp with fear and superstition. By the second day, a mob had gathered outside the jail where Kane had given Sarah shelter, their torches casting dancing shadows that looked like demons on the wooden walls. Mayor Hutchins led the charge, his usual politician's smile replaced by the grim mask of a man convinced he was fighting for his town's very soul. "She's brought the devil's own spawn to our doorstep," Hutchins roared, his voice echoing off the false front buildings. The crowd murmured agreement, their faces twisted with the kind of righteous fury that had fueled witch hunts and lynchings since time immemorial. Mrs. Patterson clutched her rosary beads until her knuckles went white, whispering prayers in 3 different languages. Kane stood on the jail's front porch, his hand resting easy on his Colt, but his heart heavy with the weight of impossible choices. These weren't outlaws or claim jumpers. They were good people driven to madness by fear. Behind him, through the barred window, he could hear Sarah humming a lullaby that seemed older than the mountains themselves. "Stand aside, Marshal," called out Jake Sullivan, the blacksmith whose arms could bend horseshoes but whose voice now shook like a child's. "That thing she's carrying ain't natural. My horses won't eat, my forge won't hold flame, and my wife can't stop crying tears of blood." The crowd pressed closer, and Kane could smell their desperation mixing with the acrid smoke of their torches. But when Sarah's voice rose in that ancient lullaby, something shifted in the air itself, and every torch in the mob's hands flickered and died simultaneously, leaving them in darkness so complete it felt like the world had ended. As the crowd dispersed into the unnatural darkness, a figure emerged from the shadows on horseback, tall, lean, wearing a duster that had seen 1,000 miles of hard travel. Kane's blood turned to ice water as he recognized the face beneath the black hat: Josiah Blackwood, the bounty hunter who'd been tracking Sarah across 3 territories. "Been a long time, Tommy," Blackwood drawled, his voice smooth as aged whiskey but twice as dangerous. Years ago, they'd worn badges side by side in Kansas, before Blackwood had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Now he dealt in human lives like poker chips, and his reputation for bringing in bounties, dead or alive, was legendary across the frontier. "There's a price on her head that'd make you rich enough to buy your own county," Blackwood continued, dismounting with the fluid grace of a predator. $5,000, posted by interests back east who know exactly what bloodline she carries. They want her and whatever demon seed she's nursing before it comes into this world. Kane's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but Blackwood raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy there, old friend. I ain't here to fight you, not yet, anyway. Just thought you should know what you're protecting. That woman's great-grandmother was hanged in Salem, but not before she cursed the rope and everyone who pulled it tight." The wind howled through the streets, carrying with it the sound of distant thunder though no storm clouds darkened the star-filled sky. Sarah's lullaby had stopped, and in the sudden silence, both men could hear something else, the sound of tiny fists beating against the walls of a womb, as if whatever lived within was eager to be born. But Blackwood's revelation about Sarah's bloodline was only the beginning of truths that would shake the very foundations of everything Kane believed. 3 days after Blackwood's arrival, the cemetery began to give up its secrets. Old Pete Santana, the gravedigger, came running into town screaming about hands pushing up through 6 feet of frozen earth. By moonrise, 7 graves had been disturbed, and the bodies that climbed out weren't the peaceful dead anyone expected. These weren't the shambling corpses of penny dreadfuls. They moved with purpose, their eyes glowing with the same green fire that sometimes flickered in Sarah's gaze. They walked the streets of Bitter Creek with a dignity that death hadn't stolen, seeking something that drew them like iron filings to a magnet. Kane found them gathered outside the jail, standing in perfect silence, their burial clothes fluttering in wind that touched nothing else. At their head stood Colonel Marcus Webb, who died in the war between the states but now wore his uniform with supernatural pride. When the colonel spoke, his voice carried the authority of rank even beyond the grave. "The child must be protected," Webb intoned, his words echoing with the power of absolute conviction. "The bloodline carries more than curses. It carries hope for redemption that's been denied for generations. We who found no peace in death offer our service to ensure this birth comes to pass." Sarah appeared at the jail window, her face pale but resolute. She pressed her palm against the glass, and the dead soldiers saluted as one, their ethereal forms shimmering like heat mirages. "The veil grows thin," she whispered, and Kane felt something shift in the very fabric of reality around them. But as the dead took positions around the jail like supernatural sentinels, a new horror approached from the darkness, one that made the walking dead seem like guardian angels. Blackwood's screams shattered the midnight quiet, echoing from the direction of the old mine shaft where he'd made his camp. Kane found him 3 hours later, alive but changed, his eyes wide with terror and his black hair turned stark white. Whatever had visited him in the darkness had left marks that went deeper than flesh. "They came for me, Tommy," Blackwood whispered, his legendary composure shattered like glass. "Things that ain't got names in any Christian tongue. Said I was hunting something that belonged to them, something that's been promised to darkness for 7 generations. His hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette, the flame dancing away from the match as if afraid to burn. The bounty hunter's horse lay nearby, not dead but drained of something essential, its eyes rolled back white and its breathing shallow as morning mist. Around the campsite, strange symbols had been carved into trees and stones, markings that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly, like living things trapped in wood and rock. "She ain't carrying no ordinary child," Blackwood continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The thing in her belly is the key to a door that's been locked since the world was young. And there's forces on both sides that'll kill to see it either opened or sealed forever." Kane helped his former partner back to town, but as they rode through the pre-dawn darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed by things that cast no shadows and left no tracks. The dead soldiers still stood their vigil, but even they seemed nervous now, their ghostly forms flickering like candle flames in a hurricane. What Blackwood had learned in that mine shaft would change the game completely, because now Kane understood, they weren't just protecting a woman and child from superstitious townspeople. As Sarah's labor pains began, she called Kane to her cell and spoke words that turned his understanding of the world inside out. "The curse isn't what they think," she gasped between contractions, her face slick with sweat that glowed faintly in the lamplight. "My bloodline was chosen to be a vessel, but not for evil, for something far more dangerous. Balance." She gripped his hand with strength that seemed impossible for a woman in her condition, and suddenly Kane could see flashes of history that books had never recorded. Salem hadn't been about witchcraft, it had been about power, ancient power that certain bloodlines carried like a genetic memory. Sarah's ancestors hadn't been cursed, they'd been guardians of something that predated both good and evil. "Every generation, one of us is chosen to carry the child that maintains the balance between light and dark," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger even as her body prepared for the ultimate trial. "But this time is different. The scales have tipped too far toward darkness, and what's coming isn't just a child. It's a force that will reshape the very nature of existence itself." Through the window, Kane could see the dead soldiers growing more solid, drawing power from something approaching. The living townspeople huddled in their homes while supernatural forces gathered for a confrontation that would decide more than just the fate of Bitter Creek. Even the stars seemed to be rearranging themselves in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "The child will have a choice when it's born," Sarah whispered, her green eyes blazing with inner fire. "To embrace the darkness its enemies expect, or to choose a path that no one, not even I, can predict. But it needs to be born free, not in chains of fear and hatred." But as her words faded, a new sound reached their ears, the thunder of approaching hooves, ridden by men whose intentions made Blackwood's bounty hunting look like child's play. They rode into Bitter Creek like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, dressed in fine Eastern clothes that couldn't disguise the coldness in their souls. Led by a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Ashford, they brought with them artifacts and instruments that had never been seen on any frontier. Their horses' eyes glowed red, and frost formed wherever they stepped, even though the air itself remained unchanged. Kane watched from the jail as these strangers set up what looked like a ritual circle in the town square, using symbols that made his eyes water and his mind recoil. Ashford approached the jail with the confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted, his pale face wearing a smile that belonged in nightmares. "Marshal Kane," Ashford said, his accent cultured but somehow hollow, "we represent certain interests that have been tracking the Whitmore bloodline for over 2 centuries. The woman you're protecting carries something that belongs to us by right of ancient contract. We're here to collect our property." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, and every plant in the town square withered and died simultaneously. The dead soldiers began to flicker, as if whatever power sustained them was being drained away by these newcomers. Even Sarah's supernatural strength seemed to waver as the contractions grew stronger. You see, Marshal, Miss Whitmore's family entered into a binding agreement long ago, Ashford continued, producing a scroll that seemed to be written in something darker than ink. 7 generations of service in exchange for power beyond mortal comprehension. The contract comes due with this birth, and we intend to honor all terms and conditions. But as Ashford spoke, Kane noticed something the Eastern stranger had missed. The dead soldiers weren't just flickering with weakness. They were multiplying, and their faces now carried expressions of grim determination that suggested the final battle was about to begin. Sarah's screams pierced the night as her labor intensified, but they weren't cries of pain. They were battle hymns that called power from sources both ancient and terrible. With each contraction, reality itself seemed to flex and bend, creating ripples that could be felt in dimensions beyond normal perception. The jail walls began to glow with symbols that wrote themselves in languages that predated human speech. Kane found himself caught between worlds as the birth approached its climax. The Eastern men chanted in unison outside, their ritual circle pulsing with dark energy that made the air thick as molasses. Meanwhile, the dead soldiers had grown into a supernatural army, with reinforcements arriving from graveyards across the territory, all drawn by the promise of redemption they'd been denied in life. "It's coming," Sarah gasped, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies only the soul could hear. "The child that will choose the fate of both worlds. Thomas, whatever happens, remember, free will is the only thing that can break chains forged in eternity." The building began to shake as 2 opposing forces collided in the metaphysical realm that overlapped with the physical world. Windows shattered throughout Bitter Creek as the pressure mounted, and even hardened frontier folk like Kane found themselves weeping tears they couldn't explain. Something fundamental was being born, and the universe was stretching to accommodate it. Through it all, Sarah's labor continued with supernatural intensity, her body serving as the battleground where ancient powers would determine the future of existence itself. Kane gripped his rifle tighter, knowing that in the end, mortal weapons might be all that stood between hope and an eternity of darkness. But as the moment of birth approached, both Sarah and Kane would discover that the greatest battles are sometimes won not with bullets or magic, but with choices that define what it truly means to be human. As the child crowned, time itself seemed to hesitate, as if the universe was holding its breath for what came next. The baby emerged not crying, but humming with that same ancient melody Sarah had sung, but now it carried notes of joy instead of sorrow. Its eyes opened immediately, revealing not the green fire of its mother's bloodline, but eyes that held every color at once, like prisms made of pure possibility. The Eastern men's chanting faltered as their ritual circle began to crack, the dark energy they'd summoned recoiling from something it couldn't contain. Ashford's confident smile vanished as he realized the child they'd come to claim was not what their ancient contracts had prepared them for. "Impossible," he whispered, his pale face growing even whiter. The bloodline was bound. But Sarah's child had been born free, and with that freedom came power that no contract could claim. The baby raised one tiny fist, and every chain, physical, spiritual, and metaphysical, shattered simultaneously. The dead soldiers didn't fade away. Instead, they smiled with genuine peace for the first time in decades and walked willingly into a light that had nothing to do with the afterlife they'd known. Kane watched in awe as the child chose not darkness or light, but something entirely new, balance with compassion, power with responsibility, strength with mercy. The ancient curse that had followed the Whitmore bloodline didn't disappear. It transformed, becoming a blessing that would ripple forward through generations yet unborn. The Eastern conspirators found their artifacts crumbling to dust, their supernatural horses becoming ordinary flesh and blood, their power over ancient contracts dissolving like morning mist. They retreated not in defeat, but in confusion, unable to comprehend a force that chose to protect rather than dominate. As dawn broke over Bitter Creek, something had fundamentally changed in the fabric of reality, and Kane knew he'd witnessed the birth of hope itself. The final confrontation came not with violence, but with revelation. As Sarah's child opened its eyes fully for the first time, every person in Bitter Creek, living and dead, human and otherwise, found themselves seeing through those prismatic eyes. They saw the truth of the bloodline's purpose, the reality of the ancient contracts, and most importantly, the power of choice that had just been reborn into the world. Ashford made one last desperate attempt to claim his prize, lunging forward with a blade forged from meteorite iron and quenched in the tears of the damned. But Kane stepped between them, not firing his rifle but simply standing as witness to what happened next. The child looked at Ashford with those impossible eyes, and the Eastern conspirator froze mid-strike, seeing for the first time the consequences of centuries of manipulation and control. Free will. The baby spoke, though newborns don't speak, its voice carrying the wisdom of ages and the innocence of new birth combined. The choice was always yours to make. Ashford's blade dissolved, not destroyed but transformed into something that could grow flowers instead of spill blood. The other Eastern men found their dark artifacts, becoming instruments of healing and hope. The dead soldiers gathered for one final salute before walking into a light that promised not paradise, but rest, honest, earned rest for service freely given. Colonel Webb paused before Kane, his ethereal form more solid now than it had been in 20 years of haunting. The watch is ended, Marshal. The child is born free, and that freedom will spread like ripples in a pond. Guard it well. As the last of the supernatural forces faded with the rising sun, Kane found himself holding a perfectly ordinary baby in a town full of perfectly ordinary people who just witnessed the impossible. The curse was broken, but more than that, it had been transformed into something that would protect the innocent rather than damn the guilty. Sarah recovered with supernatural swiftness, her green eyes now holding depths of peace instead of sorrow. The child she'd carried grew with wisdom beyond its years, but also with the simple joy of a frontier youngster who could find wonder in prairie flowers and creek water. Kane served as both protector and friend, watching as the bloodline's new purpose unfolded in ways no ancient prophecy could have predicted. Bitter Creek prospered in ways that had nothing to do with gold strikes or railroad deals. Disputes were settled with understanding instead of gunfire, children grew up unafraid of the dark, and even the hardest hearts found room for compassion. The transformation was subtle but profound, like clean water flowing through land that had known only drought. Blackwood stayed on as Kane's deputy, his white hair a permanent reminder of the night he'd learned there were forces beyond mortal comprehension. He never took another bounty, choosing instead to hunt for lost souls who needed finding rather than capturing. The Eastern conspirators never returned, but rumors reached the territory of similar children being born across the continent, all free, all choosing light over darkness. Years later, when storytellers spoke of the winter Sarah Whitmore came to Bitter Creek, they called it the season when curses learned to bless and darkness remembered how to dance with light. Kane would smile at such tales, knowing they captured something true even when the details grew wild in the telling. The rifle he'd carried that long winter still hung above his fireplace, clean and ready but never again fired in anger. Because sometimes the greatest protection comes not from the barrel of a gun, but from the courage to stand witness when miracles choose to be born in the most unlikely places. What choice would you make when faced with the impossible? Would you trust in ancient fears, or dare to believe that curses can become blessings? Comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe for more tales from the Old West where nothing was ever quite as simple as it seemed.